This is an important session, and I'm really looking forward to it. It's a plenary session, suicide postvention in young people. I think we all know how important and timely this is. We have had a cluster of suicides in our region, and I want to acknowledge anyone who's been touched by suicide here, and I'm sure there has been, because it's not uncommon, unfortunately. I also want to acknowledge the courage of the people who've come on the panel, some of the people who have had lived experience, and they're willing to share their stories, which is obviously, difficult but so important, because, as I say, sometimes it's taboo and people feel they can't talk about it, but it's so important that we do talk about it. So I'm really looking forward to today's session. We did have Talia, who unfortunately won't be our facilitator for this session, but we've got Tim Denton, who is a GP at Kardinia. Is that right? I've got that right? Almost.
About a half a day a week, and it's fantastic.
Don't talk about that too much. But yes, so Tim, I've known Tim for a long time. He's a great person. He loves facilitating people and bringing out the best in people. So I'm very fond of Tim, and he's going to facilitate today's session. Would you like to come and talk now,
Yes.
Tim? Oh, and have we got a sponsor? Lake Imaging today for our sponsor, and I think that's all I have to say.
Good. So in fact we've got a number of speakers here. And we're just, the presentation, they're 10-minute presentations, one of which is coming in online. It's been pre-recorded. And so we'll just work through the list. Rebecca's presenting first, followed by Catharina. Kristen's coming in as a pre-recording. Kim's giving lived experience. And then I'm going to present a case that I think a lot of you will be familiar with. So I guess there's not much more than let's just let her rip. We've got 10 minutes, and if we go over 10 minutes, I'll just be ringing the cowbell. So, first presentation is Rebecca.
Sure. And
So-
will I just find it myself on the...
I think
Next slide,
it
yeah.
just
Oh, okay, cool.
does that.
Thank you.
Is that right?
Yeah,
That's
and
there's a microphone.
and there's a little clicker.
Microphone here.
There's
and
the clicker
clicking.
there.
Sure.
So the information I've got is that Rebecca's a psych nurse, consultant with Barwon Mental Health Program, and you can probably expand a little bit more so you can give us an idea of...
Sure. Oh, I can do that. Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Tim. Put that down a bit. Hello, everyone. I'm just looking to see if I can see my GP here, because I might be in trouble for something, I'm not sure, but I don't think I can. But first thing I wanted to say is thank you all for the work that you do in the primary health sector, GPs and nurses and whomever you are, because that's where the action happens with regards to suicide intervention, and so you're incredibly important in the process. So I'm a psychiatric nurse. I have been for 30 plus years, and I work in the suicide intervention prevention space. I deliver assist training. I've done that for a really long time. We were just talking about that we'd met at an assist course, so that's something that I would highly recommend to anybody who can spare the time to do it. So I've worked a lot in the suicide prevention and intervention space, and also postvention. So does this little clicker forward? Okay, easy, okay. So I'd just like to start by acknowledging the Wathaurong people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. I just want to check, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, and I'm not too close to the mic?
No.
Okay, thank you. I also want to acknowledge people with a lived experience of mental illness and emotional distress, as well as their carers, as well as people with neurodiversity and people with substance use issues and a lived experience of suicide. And just to remind you to look after yourself, there was some mention of that today, but talking about suicide can be triggering or activating for any of us. Most of us have some form of lived experience. I certainly have people in my family that I've lost to suicide. I have friends, I work with people who are suicidal, and I have people in my life at the moment who are suicidal. So it's a common human experience, and at any given time, about 5% of the population will be experiencing suicidal ideation. So it's something that we all share, but it's not something that we talk about so much. The reason why we don't talk about it much is the shame and the stigma and the taboo associated with suicide. And that also makes bereavement from suicide much more difficult, which I'm sure Catharina will talk about. So just with regards to looking after yourself, sometimes memories can come up that we don't expect, and so to just take some time to sort of allow that to be present. I always say to people, if something comes up from your subconscious that you weren't expecting, that's your subconscious has let that go, and that's okay, but sometimes that can be a bit disarming. So to take a moment, take a break, and you can talk to me. And I'm sure that you guys are pretty aware of the services out there in the community as well. So I've started with this slide about knowing me and knowing you, because I think in order to talk to people frankly and openly and warmly and confidently about suicide, you need to have an idea about what you think about it, how you feel about it, be aware of your own emotions in relation to that, because a suicidal person can see that in you. And if you are confident, you are warm, you are open and you are kind, that person will get that from you. Likewise, if you have stigma or internalised stigma, it's better to be honest with yourself about that and to try and understand that more rather than to try and suppress that. Because we can talk about risk factors till the cows come home, but the thing that will keep a person alive is the relationship that they have with you. And that might be a 7-minute consultation or a 15-minute consultation. That might be the thing that keeps that person connected to life. So, what's Postvention? Postvention is the provision of services to people who have been bereaved by suicide, but it's also services to people who have attempted suicide, and we know that when someone has made a suicide attempt, they are at a greater risk of dying by suicide. That's one of the few predictive factors that we have. But I'm here to tell you that suicide is not something that can be predicted. It's not like the road toll, where there are maybe 30 variables that can be mediated by Vic Roads and by TAC. There are thousands of factors that might contribute towards somebody wanting to take their own life. So trying to predict it comes from the insurance industry way of looking at things, and human beings aren't so predictable. And also the evidence says that low and medium people die by suicide. Low and medium risk people die by suicide rather than high risk people. So high risk people are obvious. They stand out, a lot of protection is put around them. People who are in the low and medium category more often die by suicide. So, how many people are affected when someone dies by suicide? We've had a recent Royal Commission into Mental Health Services in Victoria, which was all-encompassing and incorporated primary health and schools and lots of other parts of the community. And that sort of came up with a figure of about 135 people are affected when somebody dies by suicide. And you can see from that slide there that people will have differing levels of proximity to the person. What we know is that if you've got a relative who died by suicide, that makes you a higher risk, but it's about how you feel about the person that's died and your proximity of closeness that you feel to that person. So it's not necessarily about if it's your family or not your family. And we can see there that people will take differing periods of time to recover. And indeed, if you've lost anybody to suicide, you know that you never recover, that what happens is that part of you stays in pain for your whole life, and your life gathers around that. And every time you lose somebody else, whatever that bereavement might be, that I call it a reservoir of grief. That a reservoir of grief opens internally, and you re-access that in a way. So it never really goes away. And that's to do with the nature of the death and the sense of not having been able to help that person to stay alive. So I was thinking, how can I find a really good way of explaining static and dynamic risk factors in less than 10 minutes? And probably now I've got like 5 minutes, so how am I going to do that? So I've come up with a bit of a novel way of explaining this, which is just Beck's version of static and dynamic risk factors. But we are moving away, absolutely, from using low, medium or high. And the reason for that is because the focus is about the relationship and about how you feel, your confidence in that assessment after you've done it, how confident you feel that that assessment is accurate. So I've decided to use the stress vulnerability model, or the stress bucket, because most people can relate to that, to help you to think about formulation and managing people who are experiencing distress. So here we have a stress bucket that's already half full. Do most of you put your hand up if you've heard about the stress bucket? Fairly common, most people can relate to that. So when we're thinking about the stress bucket, how much stress is in there before we even start, you can think about that as that being a person's static risk factors. And the kinds of things that go into that stress bucket are the social determinants of health, so the things that have happened to that person that they can't really change. So it could be to do with their age, their gender, their family history, their past attempts. So past attempts we know are. So those things are static. We can't modify those things. So when we're thinking about static risk factors, they're pretty much non-modifiable. Now, dynamic risk factors are the extra water going in the bucket, but you'll see that that person's bucket is already half full. And if you think that's kind of concrete in there, we're not going to be able to really get much of that out. So maybe if there's trauma in there, a person can go and work on their trauma, but those things take many, many years. So most people are kind of stuck with their static risk factors in their stress bucket. So one dynamic risk factor might be that a young person has lost their job or lost a relationship or lost a friendship. Another might be that their parents have divorced, or there are relationship problems in that young person's life. Another risk factor might be intoxication. And you can see what happens when that stress bucket gets full is that it overflows. And what happens at that time when that person's stress bucket overflows is that they might start to act on the ideas they have. And what causes them to act on those ideas? Pain. So when we talk about stress, when we talk about distress, what we're really talking about is pain. But it's not pain that other people can necessarily see. So we might take another person, might be have very similar demographics, so they might be the same age and the same gender, but they've got very few other sort of static risk factors or social determinants, things that have happened to them in life that have made them more prone, I guess, to vulnerability to suicide. So this person might have the same stressors coming in. They might have lost their job. They might have suffered, that their parents are divorcing or separating. They might also become intoxicated. But what happens is there's more room in the bucket there to sort of manage those things. And often we'll see people present to the emergency department. You'll see people probably present in your practices who are intoxicated, because intoxication is people are using substances to try and reduce their distress, to try and achieve pain relief. But when they get to a certain point of intoxication, they can no longer control how they're feeling and they become disinhibited. So you may also remember that these stress buckets often have taps on them. The taps are there to release some of the water out of the bucket, which releases proportionally a person's pain, perceived pain. These can also be thought of as protective factors. So a supportive family is a protective factor, and that might be one of the main things that anchors a person to life. And that reduces, therefore, the water in their bucket. If someone's engaged with services, that might be a protective factor as well. But if we think about, okay, services aren't open on the weekend, okay, thank you, and that type of thing, that's a fairly minimal protective factor, but it's something that reduces their suffering. A person might know how to self-regulate, a person might have stable housing. All of those things are protective factors. All of those things we can use to help let some of that pressure out of the bucket. But often people who have got fewer risk factors have also got more protective factors, if that makes sense. So when you're thinking about a population of people that you might see who are extremely vulnerable to suicide, they'll often fit that sort of my left, your right stress bucket analogy there. This comes from Spectrum, which is the Victorian personality disorder peak body. And this is another way of thinking about when you've got a person with chronic risk factors there, so maybe chronic suicidal thoughts, and when do you need to act? When do they become more acute? So that's just another a little thing that's available to you to help you think about your formulation. So, bringing it all together. Postvention is one aspect of suicide prevention that's known to work, and it's one arm of the suicide prevention strategy. Many people are affected by each suicide death, around 135, but I suspect it's actually a lot more than that. Some people are a lot more vulnerable than others. When trying to determine the likelihood of suicide, it can be helpful to think about that person's unique stress bucket as a way of just sort of thinking what's in front of me here, but also always remember the relationship with you will be the thing that keeps that person engaged and connected to life, to you and to others, but sometimes it might only be you, and that can feel pretty difficult for lots of people, but even a 5-minute caring consultation with somebody can be enough. When trying to, and static risk factors can't really be modified or changed, but dynamic ones can. So that's where you need to focus your effort. And pain relief, or letting water out of a bucket, will help you to safety plan with the young person and their family. And actually that's best led by the young person themselves and their family. Things that will protect me when I'm feeling suicidal are far better to have come from me than from so sometimes we'll want to really hold a person down and keep them safe because we're frightened. But actually if the person themselves can come up with their own protective strategies, it's much more powerful. And that's a nice picture because we're talking about something sad. And here are some of the guidelines. There's also, Victoria has subscribed to zero suicide, and particularly the first part of that strategy, so it's a strategy that's been adopted by other states in Victoria. The first part of that strategy is working with young people, very much with lived experience, and so that's something that you'll all hear about, I'm sure, but that's my 10 minutes, I believe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was fantastic.
Oh, I've gone too far forward. I think I've double
That's
clicked.
all right.
Thank you.
Don't panic.
Okay, I won't.
Right. Let's see if I can. Oh, that's it? Excellent. So, thanks very much, Rebecca. That was a really insightful presentation. I think very useful. Katrina Dumaresq. Dumaresq.
That was good job. Good try.
Is a bereavement counsellor and mental health nurse from Hope Bereavement, and she's going to tell you a little bit more about her and Hope with her presentation. Excellent.
Thanks, Tim. So, at Hope, we believe no one should be alone in their grief. So Hope is a service that's supported by the community, run by the community members for those in the community. And I'm also very nervous, so excuse me. It's a not-for-profit service, and we've been in Geelong since 1985. It's unique to Geelong. It was established when a local paediatrician realised that there was a gap in services for parents who'd lost a baby, child or older young person. And it's expanded since then. We've now got an adult grief service for people who've experienced sudden and unexpected death of a loved one. There's a specific suicide arm that's run in conjunction with Jesuit Social Services. And also now we have kids grief too, which supports children and young people who are bereaved. And I sit one day a week at Headspace to help young people who want to access our service who might not come to our office. Hope's a fully funded service, meaning there's no charge for people accessing it. We receive no government funding, and in that we don't require a mental health care plan. We welcome self-referral and community referrals, but always with the consent and agreement of the bereaved person. I'm just going to talk a little bit about bereavement versus suicide bereavement. So when I speak about bereavement, I'm referring to the experience of someone we love or care about dying. It's a normal part of the life spectrum, and we live, ultimately, we die. How we experience bereavement or grief is unique to each of us, and it's often determined by our life experience. It's not a linear process, and it's not a progression of stages, but it's a continuing process. It affects your physical and emotional well-being. It can include things like sadness, shock, anger, difficult sleeping, changes in appetite, blame, relief, increased susceptibility to illnesses and chronic disease such as hypertension, and it might include suicidal ideation for the bereaved person, as Beck said. The intensity and duration is often determined by the relationship with the person who died, i.e. the greater the love, the greater the grief, but not always. And everything I say today I'm going to say, but not always, because that's how grief is. As a general rule, symptoms tend to lessen in 6 months to 2 years, with possible increase in intensity on special occasions or anniversaries, but it's different for everybody. So suicide bereavement, I think of as, it's bereavement but on steroids. So it might include things like a sense of unreality, numbness, nightmares and intrusive thoughts, and that can last for months. People who are 6 or 8 months bereaved who are still feeling quite numb and like it's unreal. Guilt and failure are often present. Self-blame, blame for others' blame of the person who passed away, an unrelenting need to ask why, to try and make sense and understand why it happened. Feelings of shame, rejection and abandonment, anger towards the person who took their life, anger towards other people who you think may have contributed to their death, and also a sense of shame and stigma that other people will think negatively of the bereaved family and friends, which can result in feeling alone and withdrawn from others. And obviously, again, suicidal thoughts or intention. It's important not to expect too much of people who are suicide bereaved initially because of the trauma that they've experienced, but some people very quickly return to their normal life and they prefer to be busy. So again, it's very different for everybody. Some may experience a decrease in energy and motivation, and others are agitated and energised. They often refer to a change in how they live their life after the death as opposed to how they were before. And I'm often surprised by the amount of physical symptoms that suicidally bereaved people have. A lot of aches in their bodies, headaches, nausea, gut pain, etc. And differing intensity of feelings of trauma symptoms, which often depends on the relationship with the person when they took their life, and perhaps if they were present when the event happened or if they found them. Support, how to support people through bereavement. So I've got be available, listen to what they say, assist them with what they want, and I think Beck said that too. Don't think that we know what they want. You need to ask them and assist them with what they need, because they are often immobilised. So we need to be active, but active in the way we're asked to be. And I've got medication in grief, not a first option. So unless there's a mood component that goes with the grief, it's suggested in the research that I've read that medication doesn't help people through grief. Initial support often needs to be intensive and available, and they'll need time off work or school. They need time to tell their story, sometimes over and over again, and they may need referral to support services. And of course we need to assess risk, if any, to the bereaved person, because they may have an increased risk of self-harm to themselves. And then special days such as anniversaries, encourage them to note the day, and if you're able to flag that that's a special day, if they're an ongoing patient of yours, because people are delighted when people remember that their loved one died. Use their name, and if you knew them, if you were their treating person, reflect on your memories and share it with that person, because that's really important. And again, offer time off and possible increased support if you can. I'm going to skip through this because I ain't going to get 10 minutes otherwise.
You got 5 to go.
I've got 5 to go? I've got lots of talking, Tim. How to identify those impacted? Ask. As healthcare providers, you see people for lots of reasons. You're in a position to inquire about a lot of things. But if you're aware that there's been a suicide in the community, ask if they're impacted or not, and people will usually let you know. We presume when a young person dies, especially by suicide, it's the immediate family and friends who are most affected, but many of others can feel the ripple and appreciate the opportunity to be acknowledged as well. They may or may not require support after the conversation. And some examples of that can be people like grandparents, and grandparents aren't just bereaved from their grandchild, but they're also watching their child go through probably the worst experience of their life. And siblings, sometimes the siblings try to disappear because they want to protect the parents who are already suffering so badly. There's a quote from a young person that said, "I was completely devastated, but each time I went into town, everyone without exception asked me how my mum was, as if I had no feelings about it at all." So it's good to remember, as you would, siblings as well. Aunts, uncles, cousins, friends and colleagues. People like bosses can be quite impacted by losing someone who works for them. And primary healthcare providers, so GPs, nurses, everyone in the community really. And people who didn't even know the person who died. So suicide can have an impact. It might seem that they weren't involved, but they may have actually have a past history that makes them susceptible. They may have been there when the person was found. They might have belonged to a community group that they were in. So it really does go, as Beck said, to everybody. Language. Excuse me. I'm going to start with try not to use words like committed or successful. in relation to suicide, they're not helpful. Instead, perhaps you can use things like died by suicide, completed suicide, or took their life. And avoid statements like, they took the easy way out, they were selfish, he was too good for this world, they're happy now, they're in a better place. Thank you. And the other one that people who are bereaved by suicide really don't seem to like is, I know how you must feel. Thank you. So suggestions for questions. Remember, it's better to ask the question, even if it's uncomfortable for you and the person that you're sitting with, than it is to avoid their situation and pretend it didn't happen. An example could be something like, gee, it's been a tough year for young people, how are you feeling about it? Or, gee, it's been rough for your family, how are you doing? Simple question. Use your words, because when you try and use someone else's words, it never comes across as very authentic. Oh. Try to speak openly and keep communication going. They may initially not want to talk, but they might come back later on if they know that you're safe and interested in what they've got to say. What's the role of GPs in the response and in the community? So, firstly, primary care providers and GPs need to look at their own bereavement. Small communities often mean that GPs are members of the community and they may know the young person that has died. They might be their patients, neighbours, they might attend the same sporting clubs and community groups. And check how you feel about the death, but also suicide in general. Suicide of a patient may be one of the most stressful work-related events in a GP's lifetime. Grief, a possible sense of failure, shame and inadequacy, along with fear of litigation, can result in emotional turmoil, depression, burnout and even possible abandonment of a career, and even suicide yourselves. Sounds dramatic, but it happens. And GPs are among the highest rates of suicide in professionals, along with vets, dentists and police officers. So please take the time to look after yourselves and get support if you need it. So there's still debate about the role of GPs in providing bereavement support. Increased rates of mortality and morbidity following bereavement have led some to acknowledge and advocate a role for the primary healthcare team, while others question the danger of medicalising a normal process of life transition. When GPs themselves were asked, only 30% thought they'd received an educational input about bereavement support that was adequate. And I think that's probably true of most primary healthcare providers, not just GPs, and that's why referral to specialist bereavement support's often chosen. And also at a time when GPs and healthcare providers are experiencing increasing workloads, it might be that they feel they don't have time to engage in prolonged supportive interventions, which is a reality. So referral allows the bereaved person to have the opportunity they require. I'll skip that one. How can GPs reach out? If it's possible, be available in the bereaved person's world. Home visits, idealised, maybe impossible. But longer appointments and more often appointments if that's possible. Things like telehealth and phone calls can be really useful. I understand young people may feel overwhelmed. They'll be worrying about themselves, their friends, their family and the community, so they're probably more likely to engage there than doing well, aren't I? Healthcare providers. And how to link with services. So warm referrals, if you refer them while they're in their office with you, it sticks better because they trust the person that you trust. Ask them what they would like or need if they're able to decide, especially as grief progresses. Utilise services with flexible options for care provision in home, in office or outreach, and we provide those at Hope. And even in COVID, we'd go meet people in parks so that we could still catch up with them. And if there's an after-hours service, even better. Refer to services the bereaved people are comfortable to use. Headspace, doctors in secondary schools. Already mentioned Headspace. If a young person has good experience, they will spread the word. And how they feel matters, and it matters to their friends, so their friends will be more likely to speak as well. And don't forget the supports they already have. Talk to them about connecting back to their community supports, things like schools, sporting clubs, religious and cultural connections, and families. That's a resource map that we put together at Hope, that Melinda has put together at Hope. It's on our website. There are two sides to it. There are actually 3 pages in total, and you can download it if you go to Hope. Or if you want to email us, we can send you a copy. Excellent. Fabulous. And then, so that's the growing around grief theory, where people thought that grief would disappear over in time. What actually happens is that our lives actually grow around it. So we still hold that grief and we still hold that pain, but it knocks us over less often. And when it does knock us over, we can get up perhaps a little more quickly. And some quotes from some of the young people. I just wanted someone to listen to me, but everyone was just so upset and worried. How could I upset them more? I just want to talk about them. It's like they cease to exist. So that's why we say their names. And I just want to know how I can help. I just want to know what to say, or I'm so scared that I'll feel like this forever. And people often don't talk because they're scared they're going to make people feel pain, but I think they already feel the pain, so talking helps to just relieve that a little bit. And that's our contact.
Brilliant. Thanks, Katrina. I let you go over time because I think the information you're giving is so valuable. So it really is a very complex area, and it's something that's very emotional. So we'll work with it. Kristen Douglas is not here, but there's a pre-recording of her work, and she's the National Manager and Head of Headspace Schools and Communities. And so she's...
Yep, it'll just play.
Does it? You've got... someone nodding down the back. So I'll hand over.
Hi everyone, I'm Kristen. I'm National Manager with Headspace, looking after a division called Headspace Schools and Communities, and working at Headspace National. So thanks for the opportunity to present today. Just in the next 10 minutes, I wanted to go through some of the things that we've learnt through Headspace and the service delivery that we've done for the past 10 years, and just highlight some of the things around child and youth suicide and some of the connections to why GPs are critical to detection of risk, to prevention of risk, and also in the response and recovery space when there has been the event of a suicide. I'll just share my slides, and I'm sure at the end of this session there'll be an opportunity to have a conversation and ask questions. And I know that Kim Edgar, also from Headspace National, is presenting, and she can probably share really helpful information about Headspace National services and supports. It's always really important that when we're talking about suicide, no matter whether it's to GPs, ambulance officers, educators, parents or young people, that we highlight that there are sensitivities to the subject. And of course, there is always follow-up if needed, and we know that there is a range of supports that the PHN will probably offer you as GPs, but also there's some really good resources. In addition to that probably helpful message is also, over the last couple of years, we've been working with many agencies in the suicide sector to try and destigmatise language around suicide. It's no longer a crime to die by suicide, which was the original emphasis of the language of committed suicide. So we try and avoid language like that. We say less stigmatised words like they took their own life, his or her own life, they ended their life, those sorts of things. So just a gentle reminder that sometimes language can be really important, and it can be very stigmatising. So it's just a contemporary prompt. So Headspace Schools and Headspace Schools and Communities has been around for about 10 years across Headspace National, and working with Australian schools predominantly around a whole range of strategies from prevention, early intervention to postvention. One of the things that we have done in the past decade is roll out and implement the world's first national suicide school-focused response and recovery service in the event that when a school community has been impacted by a child or youth suicide or the suicide of an adult, such as a teacher or a parent. We've learned a lot in the past 10 years, sadly, but some of the things and messages I just wanted to share in the next couple of minutes with you. First of all, it's probably important to highlight the complexity around recording and understanding the risk of suicide in child and youth populations in Australia. Again, I know that there's lots of sensitivities about it. It's a group that often is identifiable. It's really impactful on schools, communities, and it ripples through families. And I just want to highlight the sensitivity behind statistics in this area. In summary, basically, and I should update this with the latest ABS statistics, but essentially 0 to 24-year-olds will die by suicide or intentional self-harm, which is often the term that the ABS uses, every week in Australia, which is really, really and horribly concerning. Every fortnight in Australia, a 0 to 14-year-old will die by suicide or intentional self-harm. The table down the bottom indicates to you that there is an acceleration of risk in various age groups, and this has graduated and increased over the past 10 or so years. The 0 to 14-year-old age range is there, 15 to 9-year-old age range accelerates again, and of course the 20 to 24-year-old age range accelerates even more so. So there's considerations here about where we see risk spikes and the age range populations where we see sudden increases. The other thing that I want to point out, and I won't go into great detail, was that a couple of years ago we did a project with the Victorian Coroner's Office where we retrospectively looked at a whole range of risks that sat within Victoria, and we looked at young people who died by suicide and how many services had they been to visit, particularly headspace centres or CAMs or KIMs. Now, what this indicated to us was that a high proportion, 45% of these young people or more, had not been anywhere near a health related or mental health related service prior to their suicide. They had, though, been somehow connected to probably a school and even a GP. But what this said to us was that a lot of young people who are very, very acutely at risk are unknown to services, and they're not involved with services, which poses the question about how do we detect risk if it's not presenting itself to a mental health service. Essentially, what that really indicated to us was the critical nature of families in detecting risk, the critical nature of schools in detecting and identifying risk, but also the critical nature of GPs and other key people in that family and that young person's life that are going to be the major risk detectors, particularly if that risk, like I said, has not been referred or that young person is not involved with a mental health service. Over the past 10 years, the work that we've done, we have developed a range of resources from suicide postvention toolkits. These have been readapted as funding sources have changed. It's now through the BU service, but fact sheets and ways that we help schools and families and young people understand grief reactions, respond to that, but also how do we move in a way that we respond in a way that's helpful, that we can look after future or protect future risk. In addition to the school postvention service, we've gone on to develop a range of other supports, and we now do similar support with resources to universities. We've developed a range of resources in responding to youth clusters in Australia, looking at suicide attempts, and there's a whole range of things that we've sort of spun off and created after learning significantly in the postvention space. So postvention essentially is the response when there has been an incident or an impact And postvention planning is really important. So every week and month, we roll out postvention planning across Australia to schools, across all sectors. And this is where schools can come and develop their capacity to, understand how they would respond if it happened in their community. We work with school leaders, school psychologists, wellbeing teams, and we try to develop these skills, because the last thing you want is people responding to this and not feeling confident or capable. And we know that suicide is not like any other critical incident. So many schools have other critical incident plans, fires, bushfires, other incidences. But this, in doing the postvention planning, provides schools a much deeper, probably in some ways more sophisticated understanding of a suicide response, because if done well, you can prevent suicide or future suicide risk. Some of the key components of the activities that we do is making sure that language around suicide is really careful, and simply that would be working with the school to work with the bereaved family about what language they're comfortable using. We need to make sure that we are responding to young people and their needs, their questions, being honest about suicide information, but also not overexposing young people to unhelpful or harmful information such as method, location, or other things that will actually increase risk across children and young people. Some of the things we dive deeper into when we're working with schools is the appropriate use of language. How do we avoid stigmatising? How do we make sure that help-seeking messages are all throughout the response and recovery efforts? And how do we look at the complexity of suicide risk? And how do we customise it to every school setting? Whether it's regional, rural, remote, metro, Catholic, government, it doesn't matter. We need to make sure that this advice is able to be customised and contextually supported to that particular school and town. Some of the things that's probably important to say is that young people can be very impulsive. So this risk can feel like it comes out of nowhere. And often this risk may have presented itself months ago or weeks ago, and it may have been to the GP, it may have been to the school teacher or wellbeing coordinator, or mum and dad or family may be aware that there was risk earlier on, and it calmed down and now it's suddenly there again. This understanding of risk and the dynamic nature of it is really important. How do we take risks seriously? How do we respond to risk in a timely manner? And what do we do in terms of safety planning? And when is the difference between presenting your child to the GP versus going to the emergency department on Saturday night because I don't feel like I can keep my child safe? So there's lots of complexity around understanding the dynamic nature of risk. We work a lot in working with schools on wrapping strategies around staff, families and young people to try and contain risk, to assess risk, and to make sure that we're responding in a helpful way, not in a harmful way. And there's a lot behind what we do with schools. We have some great resources, and this is just one that is a response plan. And what we typically do is look at the informing stage, the supporting stage, and the managing stage, and this would typically be in the first 24 hours. When we differentiate response is when we understand whether the exposure is low or widespread. And I think to sort of describe that would be sometimes suicides in a town or a school or a family, there is not a lot of exposure. The group that knows about that incident is very small, it's contained, and we're able to work in a very targeted way with that small group. Sometimes suicide is really widespread in terms of exposure because of local media, because of maybe public nature of the death, or that person, on social media it spreads like wildfire. That is where we need to apply much larger sort of containment strategies. So we often measure the levels of exposure in order to understand the levels of containment that we need. Of course, when there's high levels of exposure, sometimes we see suicide contagion. It used to be called copycatting, but we've now shifted the language. And basically, this implies that suicide risk and young people exposed to suicide risk can actually lead to increased risk in other young people. So we need to make sure that we contain information, we only share safe information, and we direct people to help seeking services very quickly. We know that when we apply this thinking of postvention, we need to understand the geographical proximity of the young person and the impact, the psychological proximity and the perceived closeness of other young people. And even through social media, you might perceive a relationship with someone who's on the other side of the country. It's not just geographical closeness and social proximity, my connection to that person, my understanding, and how I relate to that person may change the way I respond to that grief. We know that all young people have this bank account of risk factors and protective factors. It's the deficit and the surplus of what's going on with mental health. And where we can, we need to double down on protective factors, particularly when there's been incidences or impacts. And again, GPs can play a really critical role in this, in reminding families about things that we can wrap around young people to keep them safe. One of the main things we do need to do with schools is make sure that we encourage primary schools and secondary schools and educators to understand the mental health system. When do they present their child to the GP? When should we go to a headspace centre? When would I seek an appointment with a paediatrician? It's really important that we educate families and young people themselves on understanding the mental health system. Just finally, we know that sometimes, and sadly, there are clusters in towns, and I just want to say that only a coroner can determine a cluster, and often that is many months and years later after the fact. But the quicker we can contain suicide risk, the better we are at preventing future risk, and it's important that we understand that. Just finally, some of the things that we often share with PHNs or governments in terms of considerations of child and youth suicide prevention and postvention is that we need to make sure that this is targeted to child and youth. What prevents an adult suicide is different to what prevents a child and youth suicide. What supports a community after a child suicide is different often to adult responses. We can't think about assertive aftercare in the same way. It needs to be differentiated. We can't think about lived experience in the same way. It needs to be differentiated. So all in all, states and territories need to have an understanding of how we can have a whole of state suicide prevention plan, but then a much more targeted child and youth suicide prevention plan. I know that you'll be getting a lot of information via these webinars, but there's some great GP resources that we've developed at Headspace. There's also some terrific national resources available to you in understanding suicide risk, so I encourage you to dive in and find out more. My three takeaway messages to you all would be that you play a critical role in understanding and the detection of risk, but that requires you to have confidence in asking questions. And sometimes those questions are, have you thought about hurting yourself? And have you had ideas of hurting yourself? And sometimes going to do gatekeeper training is really helpful to develop the confidence. The second thing I'd say is when you notice that suicide risk is prevalent or is presenting itself in a child, a young person or a family, is have a really clear understanding of how you can direct them to what they might do that night, that afternoon, that weekend, because when the GP clinic's not open, when the school's not open, and it's after hours and in the weekends and in the evenings, that's where we see a lot of risk present. So do they have a clear line of sight of a safety plan of what they do and where they go if it's 11 o'clock at night and they're really worried? So they're the two things I'd probably leave you with. I hope you enjoy your learning opportunity. Again, please dive into the resources that we've got. Thanks, everyone.
Christian Douglas and Kristen's National Manager of Headspace Schools and Communities Program. Very useful sort of information. Kim Edgar, I'd like to introduce someone who's lived the experience, and we'll let her sort of take us through it as best we can.
Thank you. So yes, I am on the Headspace family reference group with Headspace National. So as Kristen mentioned, so thank you for having me today. I'm mother to 3 boys. My eldest is now 25. My youngest is 18, and oh, I don't have slides, by the way. You've just got me. Daniel was my beautiful, blue-eyed, golden-haired, happy boy he was a bit of a handful as a little one, and he struggled with emotional dysregulation, with learning, with socially appropriate behaviour and understanding social cues. He saw many clinicians throughout his young life and underwent an array of testing, but we had no actual diagnosis. So despite being a handful, he had been a happy little boy. However, when he hit adolescence, we saw a change in Dan, and it became clear that he was struggling with his mental health. Daniel made an attempt on his life a year before he died, and it was then that he was diagnosed with severe depression and crippling social anxiety. Now, I know we're here predominantly talking about postvention, understanding the trauma from lived experience perspective, how best to support families when they've lost a young person to suicide, but I'd first like to touch on what comes before. Because more often than not, the event of losing their person to suicide is not where the trauma begins for that family or for the people that are close to that person. We know that not all people who take their lives have experienced issues with their mental health before their death. However, we also know that a great many have. And when you have a family member presenting after having lost someone to suicide, it's entirely possible that they've been supporting their person for an extended period of time before they died. There may have been previous attempts. They may have had issues with finding supports for their person. They may have had problems navigating the system, trying to support their person while they sat on long wait lists, particularly through the COVID period, getting their person to actually engage in supports or affording the care or managing the time away from other commitments. And let's think a single parent who needs to work full time. They may have experienced a layered and prolonged trauma before ultimately the person that they've been supporting has taken their life. So it's quite likely that they're presenting to you with a long history of overwhelm and of having lived on high alert for a long time. And with all of the other layers of complicated feelings that they will be experiencing with their bereavement, they may also feel quite defeated in their loss, and they may have lost trust in the system that they feel has failed their young person and failed them. So it's therefore important that when people present to you that they feel heard, that they feel like they're being taken really seriously, and that they are able to trust that you are invested as a care provider in ensuring that you will do whatever is within your capacity to ensure that they have access to the support that they need. So you may, as a representative of the system that has failed them, need to do some work in rebuilding trust. And so much of what I'd recommend in postvention care and understanding what they might need to you, particularly as a GP, when they present in your rooms and after they've lost their person, are things I'd recommend you do with people before they're sitting in front of you, bereaved by suicide. And understand that it may have taken a great deal of effort for them to have made it into your rooms. So they may be presenting with, they can't sleep or they can't get to work and so they need a certificate. They may not be presenting to you saying, I need support, this is what's happened, I need support. And if they've lost faith in the system, they'll be presenting with these things that they need a certificate for, they need a script for, they need a whatever. But it's really important to go beyond the script, the certificate, and to ask the questions about what's really going on for them and what they really, really need. The proverb, it takes a village to raise a child, is very true, and GPs are woven into the fabric of our community, so you're very often a first point of contact for people needing support. So it's really important for all primary care providers to be proactive about being aware of about what supports might be available in the local community so that you've got an idea of what's out there when you have someone in front of you who needs that support. So this includes services and formal supports, but also informal supports, so community groups, peer-led groups, online chat groups, which may be particularly suitable for young people. Be curious and ask the questions about what kind of support they feel might need to be most helpful for them. You don't have all the answers. They, help them unpack what they might need. If at all possible, as we said, warm referrals are great. And another benefit of looking to a combination of formal and informal supports is that sometimes there will be a wait list to get into services. And so you might need to be thinking about what might help in an interim period. or their support needs might change over a period of time, and they may move from relying more on professional supports to looking for more community-based supports that are safe and non-stigmatising, and they may move back into the space where they are struggling again, and they really need more formal supports as well. It's really vital to validate and normalise their feelings of emotional distress and despair. So you want to give them hope that they or their bereaved young person won't always feel like they do at that moment, and that they may always have really strong feelings around the loss of their loved one, but that their lives will grow around their grief, as has been discussed. So there'll be continue to be good days and bad days, but hopefully those really bad days will become less frequent. It can be really difficult to think and painful to think that their person is gone, and so is their relationship with that person. However, it can be helpful for them to understand and for you to help have conversations around this, that their relationship will continue with that person, and to think about ways to remember them. So to still have them as part of their lives, discuss that they may want to think about opportunities to connect with and remember their person. And parents and young people need to understand that these really strong feelings might be overwhelming, particularly for young people. They might not have experienced death before, and they might find it really difficult to manage the way that they're feeling. So it's really important that they know that this is normal and it's okay, and that you're going to help them through it. As a society, we don't deal well with grief, and we tend to want to move people along into a happier space as quickly as possible. So they may feel that this is the expectation of everyone else around them, because it's uncomfortable for the people around them. And so they may feel shamed into silence, that they're finding it so difficult, particularly with the complexity of stigma associated with suicide death. And this can be a really isolating experience, and stigma is silencing. So people speaking with you about their really confusing mix of emotions, this might actually be the first time that they've been able to open up to anyone. So it's critical to validate and to normalise their feelings. Something else is, like in those really early days, and some of the just practical things, is to remember that they are in a fog of pain, and their cognitive function might quite compromised. So you may make a number of recommendations, and they may be lucky to remember one of them, or they may be really easily confused. Write things down for them, get them to repeat back to you. If you can, check back in with them in a week or so to see if they need to come back for another appointment. Telehealth, house visits if possible. Try and be flexible in how you can be providing the care, and then check in to see if they've actually managed to access recommended support. So remember, when people are in really deep grief, that they might find it very difficult to continue to be proactive about their own care, particularly if they're focused on supporting other family members. Something that I found particularly helpful and is good to recommend too is probably family therapy can be really helpful. And even if the whole family doesn't attend, because it can be really difficult to get young people to engage with it, but it can still be very helpful to work through and understand strategies for communicating effectively within the family and with the other young people. You may also see, if you have a parent or even a young person in front of you, but there may also be, you see very different presentations of grief within the same family unit. So it's important to help parents to understand the different responses to loss and grieving. And some may be really obviously struggling. They might be sad and down and what we would say they look depressed. But some go into an overdrive. They're like, I'm okay, and they're possibly avoiding actually working through their feelings and blocking them out with overcommitting to work or study or sport or becoming involved with drugs, drinking and partying in a way that's out of character. And any ongoing change in behaviours can represent unhealthy coping strategies and potential risk. So you may have a parent of a young person who's lost a friend or sibling, and they present as scared and worried about their young person, but they don't know what to look for. They don't know what they're looking for to be worried about their young person. They don't know what the red flags are. They don't know what to be concerned about. So it's important to ask the curious questions, because they don't know what to tell you. So you need to ask them. You need to be drawing this out of them so that you can fully understand what the situation is, and help them to learn to identify risk, and then to provide practical strategies for understanding what an increase of risk looks like, and then what to do when they see that risk increase. As Kristen said, help them to understand if and when to step up support. Help them to understand what a safety plan is, how to develop it, how to enact it, to understand what overt and covert risk is, how to identify it, what to look for, how to monitor, and really, really importantly, how to have conversations around all of this with their young person. Make sure that they know that asking about if a young person is considering suicide does not increase the risk of someone wanting to take their lives. Because, and this is something that I learned in Assist, and, if you ask that question, it's a really frightening question to ask, and you might be really scared of the answer that you're going to get. But once you have that answer, you have the information that you need to then go forward. So, and suicide is not really about people wanting to end their lives. It's about wanting to end the pain. So it's important for parents to understand that, and for other young people who may have been impacted on by suicide to understand that as well. So this is something that the parents might need guidance on speaking to their young person about, because young people can't understand why their friend or sibling took their life, and that it's about wanting to end the psychological distress and pain that they can't see a way out of at that time. So look to information and supports to assist people supporting a young person through this, so that they feel as much as possible that they have the knowledge, the strategies and the tools to continue to adapt to their young person's needs. Does the parent in front of you have the resources that they need to support their young person and themselves, and where can they find them? If you have a young person in front of you rather than family, I feel really strongly that it's important to include the family in conversation where possible. Too often, privacy concerns are touted as a reason to leave family members out of the group, and if the young person might say, no, I don't want mum to know, I don't want dad to know, whatever it might be. But family members are arguably the ones who spend the most amount of time with young people, and a very recent study showed that mothers are the person that young people rely on for support the most. So sometimes I don't want to involve their parents for many reasons. However, try and work with that young person on how to communicate with their parents to help them at that particular time. But it also, it obviously sets everyone up for improved future communication, and that's always a good thing. So if you're doing what you can to support the family, you are wrapping around the young people that might be affected by suicide. So there's been a bit of discussion about protective factors. So when you have someone presenting about bereaved by suicide, or a parent who's worried about their own young person who's bereaved by suicide, you may be considering what protective factors they have in their lives. Help parents to understand what protective factors are and how they serve to strengthen a person's resilience. So help them to understand that they relate to, the social and emotional skills and attributes, the things that are inside that person, but also, how positive social connection, engagement with work, on study, or their church, engagement with activities such as sport, as music, feeling safe in their communities, feeling part of their community, a sense of purpose, and how important all of these things are. And that if they see those things dropping off, that's a sign of concern. That's something to be concerned about, and it's something to be, trying to work through. We know that those bereaved by suicide are at a much higher risk of suicide themselves. So, good postvention support it's suicide prevention. And I strongly believe that everyone in our community, we all have a responsibility to those around us, and that suicide prevention is everyone's business. And we may all find ourselves acting as a first responder in some way at some time. So we all have the ability to have a positive or a negative impact on those that we're interacting with, particularly those that are going through a difficult time. So you all have a really important role in the village, in the community, as a confidential ear, a provider of knowledge and resources. You're also in a position to be a conduit to the network of other services and supports that work to wrap around people when they come to you, having had what will most likely be the most traumatic experience of their lives. So better informed communities, better supported communities, better connected communities are healthier communities. So we all need to be proactive about making that happen. And thank you so much for listening, and I hope that some of what I've said is useful or helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. That would have been a rather difficult presentation, and we appreciate you sharing that with us. I just wanted to... this is a case that you might be familiar with, a series of cases you might be familiar with that is shown in this case here. So we're looking at it from the point of view of case management of a suicide patient, or a suicidal patient, sorry. And part of the term I thought was to talk about GPs and protecting them against vicarious trauma. The case is an interesting one in that it's, UP was a 25-year-old female who presents with suicidal ideation. So she came in with expressions of suicidal ideations, feeling very anxious, tearful and depressed with reasonably persistent suicidal ideations over the last few weeks. No plan, however, and no prior attempts. She had been associated with, she had associated loss of appetite, disrupted sleep, social withdrawal in the last 2 to 3 weeks. She expressed the fact that she felt guilty that she'd survived when her close school friend had suicided 10 years before. And this week she presented after the 10th anniversary of a friend's suicide. So it was the reason for the ideations was, in fact, it was a 10-year anniversary. She expressed immense guilt. Why was she the one that had survived when her best friend and 4 others had suicide over a 4-month period? And this was in 2009. You probably remember it was based around Western Heights, where there was a process of serial suicides. She'd suffered self-harm in the past, but not for many recent years, not for a few years. And she was well supported at home by her parents and siblings. I'm just going to go back into the coronial inquest that was in 2013. And this is taken from the Geelong Advertiser. It was actually a good article in the Advertiser, talking about the coronial inquest, giving a good background to the circumstances of the Western Heights situation over a 4-month period in 2009. And this was published at the time of the inquiry was winding up in November 2013, so 4 years later. The State Coroner was Ian Gray, and he presided over a 3-day inquest which was set up to look at the youth suicide cluster and ensure that the best possible prevention response strategies were in place. This came about after the deaths of 3 Western Heights students, a 15-year-old, a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old who ended their lives in separate incidents in 2009, 3 months apart. 2 other suicides in the vicinity, but not at Western Heights, were also recorded in the same age group with secondary students. So the inquest was also tasked with investigating the role of bullying, particularly cyberbullying, and how this affects the mental health well-being of young people. The term contagion was certainly brought up, and the effect of other suicides have on those considered at risk was also an integral part of the inquest. The court heard evidence about how exposure to suicidal behaviour from other people in a social network can impact on teens, as well as how media reporting affects those at risk. Tragedy, the 3 deaths being investigated by the coroner, form part of a much wider context of the 5 suicides that occurred in Geelong at the same time, or within about a 4 to 5 month period. In the case of ZH, he ended his life after a fight with a long-term girlfriend, TJ, and came just weeks after another Western Heights student had suicided. Another student who didn't attend the school had also suicided, as I alluded to before. The Coroner's Court's spokeswoman said that the 5 families were contacted, but not all wanted to participate in the inquest, which the coroner said, well, this doesn't mean that their deaths will not be investigated, it just means that the circumstances of their deaths will not form part of the public hearing, the spokeswoman said. So the most gut-wrenching moment of the inquest was when NR's mother, Karen, took to the witness stand and with red-rimmed eyes, she told the court about her daughter, the happiest, most gorgeous little girl you could meet, who ended her life after using social media. The details of that outline conversation have been suppressed by the court, and we're aware of what can occur on Twitter, etc., with the experiences recently at the ABC. Mrs R told the inquest she could not understand why her little girl had ended her life, but counsellors have told her that CR's young brain had not been able to comprehend the finality of suicide. I put that in because it was in the article. If you could have, so Mrs R said, if you could have a room full of people, she'd be the last one that you would predict So the unpredictability is a really big factor in this issue. She also said she believed the media should stop reporting on suicides because they may have put the idea in her daughter's head. It's in their faces all the time, she said. It gives them an option. Youth, however, Pat McGorry, the youth mental health professor, Pat McGorry, who didn't speak at the inquest but made a comment later, said media coverage could in fact help other needless deaths. So there was a role for the media, but it needed to be toned down a bit or following certain protocols. He went on to say, I very much feel that the mother who did think the media played a role in her daughter's death because that's her experience and her opinion. But I do think we need to push forward. The media can actually help reduce suicides by showing people what happens after death, by showing that it is real. Mr. McGorry, or Professor McGorry, who was named Australian of the Year in 2010 for his work in improving youth mental health, said he hoped that the inquest would deliver recommendations that would lead to better services. He said most people kill themselves when they're experiencing severe mental distress. We have to encourage help seeking and have somewhere that's acceptable for young people to go. Most disturbing news items have support lines these days which actually quote various helplines that are relevant. So that's sort of part of the protocols that have come in since then. In the case, if we get back to the original presentation of UP, the 25-year-old female, the first thing to do was she was ready to articulate, so there wasn't too much need for me to actually investigate too much. She presented initially with a feeling of, as I say, of reasonably common symptoms of depression and anxiety, but very quickly was able to sort of bring out the fact that she in fact had suicidal ideations herself. I was fairly careful to keep my mouth shut, which, as you can appreciate, is sometimes hard. But in this situation, this is the classic, and it's the same in Aboriginal health. First thing is keep your mouth shut and listen, and let them run the agenda. And this is what I did, and she was able to articulate very succinctly what her feelings were, and as I gently sort of probed, she was able to connect it to the 10-year anniversary of her friend. So she had free ventilation of her feelings while validating her story by me listening and taking appropriate notes. And I think the concept, in education, in medical students, it's always said keep eye contact. I've always thought that that's a great story, but listen and verify is a much more effective way of letting the person know that you're listening and taking in what they're saying seriously. I've encouraged her to contact me in the following week for follow-up, which she did. I asked her also to call or come in at any time if she felt at risk. And at that follow-up consultation, she stated that she had little more control in the way she was feeling, and that her underlying guilt was sort of still hard to overcome, but improving. I had also given her the list of contact numbers. Lifeline was one, but also the fact that, and it's very comfortable to know that where you've got a hospital ED, as we do in Geelong and presumably elsewhere around this district, right out the footprint of the Western Victorian Primary Health Network, is that an ED will immediately sort of take seriously anyone that presents with serious mental health issues. So it's a last resort, if you like, but it's a pretty important place because it's a definitive place to go. So that was the case. We agreed that we'd have regular contact. I saw her again a week after, and at 3 weeks later, where she felt progressively more in control. I'd given her a handout from Mental Health Care Plan, which actually had the contact numbers on it. We, on the first consultation, did a mental health care plan and arranged for referral to a psychologist that we discussed and agreed would be appropriate. and she was able to get in within about 3 weeks. So in that intervening 3 weeks, I sort of made myself available to be there for her. As I mentioned, those other contacts. So she was able to see the psychologist, in a matter of 2 weeks, and she benefited from this service and felt she was listened to, which was the feedback, having seen the psychologist. She'd noted that in the past she'd avoided seeking attention, so it was important that she'd broken through this situation. I was actually looking at it from the point of view of how does a GP protect themselves, so it's slightly different from what the previous discussion's been about, but it's worth thinking about because vicarious stress is constantly there. In this case, I discussed it with another colleague in the clinic, sat down and just over a cup of coffee chatted about it so that I felt that I was actually able to vent the way I was feeling, because it can be very stressful. I also did it to reassure that the approach I was taking was known and acceptable, and as well as a debrief, so that I could sort of get some backup that I was on the right track and would accept any criticism from that. The discussion and my notes, and I do take reasonably extensive notes, allowed for another GP in the practice to manage if UP presented unexpectedly while I was there, so that they could pick up the trail of my thinking. And of course that was also embedded in the mental health care plan which we have at the practice. The psychiatrist led GP peer groups, which the Primary Health Network runs, are also a good example of a place where you can discuss difficult cases with other peers with a psychiatrist present. So from the point of view of GP protection, that's important. And so we'll hand it over for discussion and take questions. We've got the only thing we need to do is make sure that the microphone's used both for questions and for answering. So we'll take it from there. I'll probably stay here because chairs are too high. Has anyone got any questions?
Yes, I've got a question here from someone from the online audience. So as a youth suicide prevention support service here at Youth in Search, one of the discussions is probing for information on the plan if we suspect suicide ideation. Can you share your thoughts on this being appropriate or helpful discussion?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I was not listening to the question because I was trying to work out whether this was on.
That's
or not.
okay.
My apologies.
I'll repeat it.
Thank you.
So, one of the discussions that's often had is for clinicians to probe for information on whether the person has a plan if they're suspecting suicide ideation. Can you share your thoughts on whether you think this is appropriate or helpful discussion to have?
Do you mind if I answer? Are you happy for me to answer? It's part of safety planning to ascertain whether the person, because you're trying to determine whether a person has a plan, how immediate that is and what method that they're thinking about. But the important thing before that is to listen to the person's story, and I think that was really well articulated by everyone today, that if you go straight from, so most people, because they're anxious, they ask, have you been having thoughts of suicide? If the person says yes, then they go straight into safety planning. And that can be harmful to people because it can feel alienating, jarring, dismissive. It can feel like it's all about you and your piece of paper that you've got there and protecting yourself. So absolutely that information needs to be ascertained, but first about listening to the person's reasons for wanting to die and understanding what's going on for them, because by listening you provide the opportunity for catharsis, which provides the opportunity to let some of that water out of the stress bucket or to form a therapeutic relationship, to feel heard. All of those things, people, often jump to safety planning because it's something that we can do and it feels practical. So absolutely it needs to, and method of lethality is really important because we can disable that plan. So we absolutely need to know that information. But if a person said yes, don't jump to it straight away. Do you like to say anything?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything.
Thank you. Have we got questions in the room?
Do you want to discuss what we've gone over this afternoon to pick up any highlights or make any comments?
I also wanted to let people know, because I didn't let you know at the start, I work in point of entry, so I'm manager for education and training, but I also work at phone triage, the outreach team. Please don't throw anything at me, but you can ask any questions about that, because I know there's sometimes, there's issues around accessing services, so just to let you know that. Did you want to say anything specific now to what we've been talking about? Or?
I don't think so. I'm not
sure. Do you want to say anything? Just.
The message has been said a number of times by all of us, but the most important thing is to listen and really listen and ensure that the people in front of you feel heard. And yeah, I would agree. It's really important to not go into fix-it mode. We really, that's a human nature thing that we just want to fix this, right? But that can just make people feel like it's not about them, it's about you.
Just a really simple little thing. The Hope's service, is that just Geelong region, or does that reach out across Victoria? Do you have much online? Are there other areas that can benefit by that?
So technically Hope is Geelong based, and we work with people who live in the Geelong area. We can occasionally accept referrals that come from other areas, but we're so strapped at the moment with local referrals that we find that difficult. We do telehealth, we do phone consults, so that's allowed us to pick up people in a wider reaching place, but we would be very quickly overwhelmed if we let that happen. And yes, it is unique to Geelong, so Bernie Jenner started it, made it unique to Geelong, and we've continued with that.
Can I just speak to how amazing Hope is as a service? Because, it was that for me, having Annie, the counsellor with Hope, sitting at the table, at my dining room table a couple of weeks after having lost Dan, was the first opportunity that I had to have a conversation with someone who I felt actually understood anything about what it is that I was experiencing. And it was just so helpful. And they run early bereavement groups, and so, where there's people who are together for a number of weeks, but then the counselling service, you can keep going, and then years down the track, because things do resurface years down the track. I'm about to hit the 5-year anniversary, and it's looming, and I know it's hard. I know it's going to be hard, and I don't know. Will I need to tap back into some formal supports? Maybe, but there's also art therapy. There's a range of supports provided by Hope, and it's really worthwhile looking at what it is that they do, because they provide an amazing support for our community.
Would you like me to talk a little bit about what we do at Hope?
We're winding up.
Well,
I think look at their website, because it sounds like it's a great resource for us to look at, and I think we will be sending resources from this talk in an email in a week, so I think it's worth looking at, because obviously it's a great organisation. Sounds like it's got useful information for us to understand this as well.
Yep.
Yes. Sorry, Tim. Do you want to say any words?
Not really.
Look, I want to just thank all our panel members. I mean, particularly you, Kim. I think it's so courageous to come up and tell us about your experience, but so powerful and so important. There's so many lessons in what you told us about, so thank you. I've really taken a lot from this. I think the point is engagement, really taking the time to engage with our young people, and that's hard sometimes, but I think we really need to really make an effort to do that, and that sometimes we have to do a bit of work to do that. They don't necessarily just tell us stuff, and then engagement with the family as well, and making it easier for people to engage with us. That's what I took from, and the language, how we say things. So thank you. I really want to give everyone a round of applause. It was an excellent session.